Good morning. This is Ron, and it is Sunday, June 17th. Happy Father's Day. Welcome to Story Time. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, this is Ron, the only true conservative in the United States of America, speaking to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. So I was watching another episode on YouTube of John Stossel, of his particular channel, watching his channel, watching it this morning, and he was, well, it was yesterday actually, that he was interviewing a couple of Latin American journalists. One was from Guatemala, and I don't know what country the other person was from. And he was interviewing them about socialism in Venezuela and how Venezuela got to where it is. How did it become socialist? As John Stossel had said that at its height, Venezuela was the richest economy in South America, and it had the best economy going. And now it's a basket case. People are fleeing um, every day, and they're fleeing because they can't get food. They can't get medicine. It's a disaster, and there's constant news reports about Venezuela and what the disasters that are occurring in Venezuela. And so he's interviewing these journalists, and he's asking, how did it get this way? How do you go from being an outstanding economy to a socialist basket case? And the lady from Guatemala was saying that the way it happened was through the Venezuelan culture, by subverting Venezuelan culture, the news and arts, etc. And this is my point exactly. This is where the right in the United States of America goes wrong each and every day. Okay, it further buttresses my point that it is not politics that shapes our culture, but our culture that shapes our politics. And that's the way it is all over the world. That you're not going to have any particular political system without a culture to support it. If you have a kleptocracy, it's you have a culture that is kleptocratic. And for instance, in the Middle East, you have a lot of dictatorships and some rather bad governments in the Middle East, in part because of the culture, or not in part, but completely because of the culture. One of the things in Middle Eastern culture is that lying is very common. It is very common to just bald-faced lies and about things that are relatively inconsequential. You can ask a man, "Hey, do you know Saddam Hussein?" And he's going to say, "Well, of course I do. I talked to him yesterday." When, as a matter of fact, this guy's never met Saddam Hussein before in his life. But that's a common practice. That's a cultural attitude. It's perhaps that a person's pride or a man's pride comes before what is honest. And if telling the truth is going to make him look bad or make him look small, then he's not required to tell the truth. And if you don't have any value for the truth, then how can you have any type of a true justice system? How can you have a democracy? Because democracies and republics are based on certain values, and one of them is honesty. Without honesty, elections are ridiculous. You have to. Everybody in the culture has to value honesty, for instance. So, and this lady is making my point that through the arts, through various cultural means, they subverted Venezuelan culture. I mean, the socialists, Hugo Chavez, and by subverting that and using culture to get into people's psyche and convince them that there are certain things that they should value that they didn't value before. For instance, another way of putting it, in this country, it is common now that if somebody offers you something for free, you take it. You're thrilled. Oh, look at this! I got this for free. You hear about it all the time in advertisements. Get one, buy one, get one free. This is free, 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 free. There was a point in American history in which no one would take anything for free. You didn't offer things for free because no one would accept it. Part of our culture that you just didn't accept something for nothing. You earned everything you had. Every piece of property, you want to be able to point to that and say, I earned it. I worked for that. Nobody gave it to me. That was a point of pride. And beyond pride, character. It demonstrated to people who they were dealing with. They were dealing with a person of character. So, and now we have a situation again where that's been over the years, and I think predominantly in the 60s and 70s, where the idea of getting something for nothing was what they put into our culture. Hey, of course you want to take something for nothing. You'd be crazy not to accept something for free. You'd be cuckoo. And so you get into welfare. And that's part of the reason why people wouldn't accept welfare a long time ago, decades and decades ago, was because, again, I'm not going to accept something for nothing. I'm going to earn my way back, if I'm strapped, or I'm going to die trying, but I'm not going to take something for nothing. So you come up with a welfare system and a welfare society. Well, there's no point to it if nobody's going to take the welfare, if nobody's going to take the food stamps. You're wasting your time, you're wasting your money. So you have to subvert the culture to convince people they want something they really don't want. So, and then the people on the right go along with the subversion. Rush Limbaugh, as I've mentioned before, is famous for giving away iPhones and iPads, particularly around Christmas time. Not because any listener calls up, he'll just say, "What kind of an iPhone do you want? What kind of an iPad do you want? What kind of yeah, what do you work with AT&T or whomever?" But he gives it away. He's giving them something for free. They didn't earn it. They didn't work for him. They didn't even at least um, vie for it via some type of contest where they have to answer a question or do something like that. And so, if it can be said that being conservative is part of being conservative, at least culturally, at least if you're living as a conservative, is to be a person who refuses to take something for free, and being a liberal or socialist is being a person that's more than willing to take something for free. Rush Limbaugh is encouraging people to move culturally to the left. And if you're somebody who's willing to accept something for free, an iPad, an iPhone, or whatever, how can you begrudge your neighbor for taking welfare? How can you begrudge your neighbor for taking food stamps? How can you begrudge your neighbor for taking Medi-Cal, Medicare, Social Security, any other government program that comes along? How can you say it with a straight face? How can you look yourself in the mirror if you're taking freebies, but you're going to sneer at all your friends, relatives, neighbors that also take freebies? And how do you make the differentiation? Do you say, well, the freebies from the government are terrible, but the freebies that I get are okay? Doesn't, sounds like hypocrisy to me. And the point is that psychologically now you're trapped. You may say, yes, I'm a conservative and I'm going to vote for conservatives. But if those conservatives come along and say, well, we want to change the welfare system, we want to diminish it or do away with it entirely, you, as a conservative, if you're used to taking things for free, you're going to resist that notion. You're going to resist it. You're going to go to your politician, the one you voted in, the one you wanted to be conservative, and tell him, no, don't do that. Don't take away welfare, right? The other thing is that if we have a culture that says if it feels good, do it, which is promoted not only by the left, but now these days promoted by people on the right. And you have it feels good, do it. So that means I get to go out. I'm an 18, 25-year-old man. I get to go out and sow my wild oats every weekend. Okay. And don't ask me to wear a condom. Okay. The girl's going to have some birth control pill. And if the birth control pill doesn't work, don't ask me to pay child support. Uh-uh. I'll foot the tab for an abortion, but don't expect me to pay for to pay child support. Another way of saying it is that the authority and responsibility issue is turned on its head, where you expect to be able to operate with impunity, do whatever I want, whenever I want, without having to accept any consequences. And if that's the way the culture is, then how can you expect those people that are participating in that to vote against it? Vote for people that are going to try to take away the pill. Vote for people that are going to try to do away with abortion. You can't. Okay? Not without changing their minds, i.e., changing the culture first. Getting these young men that are 18, 25 to be ashamed of themselves for going out and slinging their seed, so to speak, every weekend, and get them to do things the right way. Go out, find a girlfriend, invest time, energy in her, get married, have children, etc. So, but again, this interview was very telling. Again, it's the culture, stupid. It's not the economy, it's not the politics, it's the culture, stupid. You've got to be able to see where the left is undermining our culture and step in and do something about it. And very often it's all it is to thwart the left is simply stand your ground. Because again, conservatives have nothing to prove to socialists. The socialists have everything to prove to conservatives. Okay, when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the Anglican Theological Review. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm back, and I'm reading from the volume 99, number 4, fall 2017 issue of the Anglican Theological Review. Okay, and I'm reading an article. It's called Theological Interpretation, Second Naivete. And this is a section called Alternative Understandings of Theological Interpretation. What I have outlined above is my understanding of theological interpretation, as I have seen it developed in the work of leading scholars like Ricoeur and Childs and Levinson, and as I've sought to practice it in my own writing. I hope it would be acknowledged by at least some of my colleagues as a recognizable and helpful portrayal of significant contemporary movements. I need to acknowledge, however, that there are distant alternative contemporary understandings of what theological interpretation is. First, I recognize that thus far I have not mentioned arguably the most prolific and most widely read of contemporary theological interpreters of the Old Testament, Walter Brueggemann. Brueggemann has probably done more than any other living Old Testament scholar to bring the Old Testament alive for people. He shares many of the concerns and understandings outlined above, not least the importance of a second naivete, and offers memorable and engaging readings of the Old Testament in his many works. My reason for not mentioning him sooner is that he is somewhat sui generis in his approach and resists easy categorization in terms of trends and movements. He has tended to maintain a rather distanced and at times polemical stance towards attempts to re-engage classical theological categories and to re-articulate an explicitly ecclesial frame of reference for interpretation, as in the work of Childs and those influenced by him. He reckons such attempts are likely to domesticate the surprising and challenging voices of the Old Testament. He is also distinctive in his rhetorical readings and socio-political concerns. These have the advantage of pressing the question of what real difference the Bible might make to contemporary existence in the United States, not just in church or in a lecture room, but out on the street or in the hallways of power. The drawback is that he can pass over real differences between biblical and contemporary contexts too easily, and Brueggemann can read negatively things that the Old Testament presents positively if they do not fit his socio-political template. However helpful it is, for example, to view Solomon's reign in Jerusalem, including his building the temple, as no more than an entirely negative precedent for contemporary U.S. militarism and economic aggression and its religious legitimations. A second distinct understanding of theological interpretation, which is both more widespread and more difficult to characterize than the work of Brueggemann, can be illustrated from a recent book, A Manifesto for Theological Interpretation. This is a collection of essays arising from the Scripture and Hermeneutics seminar at SBL meetings in 2012 to 2014, which is itself an offshoot of the major Scripture and Hermeneutics seminar that, with the sponsorship of the Bible Society and some academic institutions, met from 1998 to 2007 and produced 8 significant collections of essays in a Scripture and Hermeneutics series. Central to the continuity of these seminars has been the role of Craig Bartholomew, who was entrusted with the leadership of the Scripture and Hermeneutics seminar from its inception, and has been involved in the editing of all publications, including the recent manifesto. To be sure, the manifesto is suitably restrained in its claims, quote, not the only, first, or final word on theological interpretation, unquote, and its essays engage issues that feature in my own account, such as canon, ecclesial context, and the existential dimensions of good theology. Nonetheless, it represents an understanding that is distinct from what I have outlined above. I initially hoped that the Scripture and Hermeneutics seminar would be attempting a basic reconstrual of biblical interpretation as a whole, somewhat in the manner of Yale scholars, shifting the debates into fresh categories downwind from the typical liberal conservative standoffs about issues of history and historicity that have characterized modern biblical scholarship. But although each published volume from the seminar contains interesting and diverse perspectives, the overall direction and stance of the project over time seemed to be less concerned to seek fresh categories and conceptualizations for biblical interpretation than to reformulate familiar conservative categories and conceptualities for biblical interpretation in a fresh way. And this continues in the manifesto. Thus, for example, philosophical considerations for not ruling out the reality of God and divine action are appealed to. The limits of typical biblical criticism and the often speculative nature of its conclusions are pointed out. The basic historicity of biblical portrayals of events is affirmed as necessary for biblical reliability for faith. These are time-honored arguments by thoughtful conservative Christians, arguments that can have real value and that make sense to many people. But, for better or worse, they represent no real re-envisioning of biblical interpretation in the light of new hermeneutical resources. It is an unsurprising corollary that the manifesto shows no concern with a second naivete or with the real challenges of ideological critiques or with the importance of making conceptual space for and learning from Jewish theological approaches to the Hebrew Scriptures. Craig Bartholomew's essay that concludes the manifesto illustrates this lack of re-envisioning. Bartholomew wants to give covenant a central role in understanding the biblical portrayal of creation and redemption. However, he notes that, quote, for the most historical critics, covenant is late and therefore excluded from being as central to the infrastructure of the Old Testament as we have suggested, unquote. He recognizes that, quote, there are historical issues in biblical interpretation that are complex and best held open in the face of no solution at hand, unquote, but emphatically states that, quote, covenant is not one of them, unquote. Rather, quote, the validity of the Old Testament's witness depends on covenant as an early institution in Israel. For that and other reasons, we position ourselves on the side that affirms covenant as emerging early in the life of Israel, unquote. And he implies in passing that Childs might be sympathetic to this position on the grounds that Childs, quote, pushed in the direction of seeing covenant in the Pentateuch as not anachronistic, unquote. Unfortunately, this misrepresents Childs' approach. For example, Childs, in the course of discussing, quote, the canonical shape of the Sinai witness, unquote, says this about the Pentateuchal material in which covenant is most prominent. Quote, in spite of much evidence that these chapters have indeed undergone a complex history of development, in my opinion it is methodologically a mistake to make the writing of an Old Testament theology directly dependent on its historical reconstruction. Rather, the approach being proposed is to describe the theology of the Old Testament according to the intertextuality of its canonical shaping, and to understand how this corpus of material was ordered and rendered within the context of Scripture. Unquote. Bartholomew also seems unaware that issues of interpretation and biblical validity might be cast differently, and clearly illustrates why scholars have often been nervous about allowing theological concerns to be brought into discussions of historical issues. How might the issue of covenant be handled in the mode of theological interpretation that I am proposing? Initially, one should make a clear distinction between A, the world within the text, what the Old Testament actually says in its received final form, which is what readers encounter, and which has been in some way authoritative for its would-be believing readers through the ages, and B, the world behind the text, all the questions about the composition and date of the text and the origins of its content that are central to discussions of the history of Israel and of the development of its religious thought and practices. The question of the origins and date of the covenant in Israel is a world behind the text question and needs to be addressed with the methods of historiography. One can always argue the question on its own merits if one is unpersuaded by common arguments. But whether covenant is early or late, whatever exactly those loose formulations envisage, what is really at stake in determining the validity of the Old Testament witness about covenant? The answer to this surely lies in an evaluation of the subject matter of covenant as an articulation of some of the central dynamics of the relationship between the Lord and Israel, and an evaluation of the fact that those voices that now constitute Israel's scriptures, whenever the voices arose, have been received as authoritative for future generations of Israel whose rationale and identity is depicted in these particular writings. The form in which Israel's faith has been preserved, the accounts in its writings that were privileged and became the form in which the material was to be influential for future generations, clearly and unambiguously gives covenant a central role. Covenant is central to major parts of the Old Testament, whether or not it was central in the history of Israelite religion. And covenant has been an important category in Jewish and Christian appropriation of Scripture down the ages. A second naivete approach will resist allowing the validity of the biblical portrayal to be resolved in terms of a limited range of options for understanding the human processes that putatively gave rise to it. A theological understanding of this validity should surely be a matter of determining whether the dynamics of covenant are a meaningful account of the relationship between God and His creation, and judgments here are ultimately inseparable from judgments about the wider canonical portrayal within the Bible as a whole, and the trust to be placed in its theological witness as a guide to life with God. More could be said. My proposed recasting of the issues is not the only or necessarily the best way of tackling them, but it does offer a paradigm shift for considering issues of validity and authority in the Old Testament, a shift away from prioritizing particular historical arguments, whether of a conservative or liberal nature, toward prioritizing different concerns to appraising the specific religious subject matter of the text when its portrayal is read with full imaginative seriousness as part of a literary witness received as authoritative by Jews and Christians since antiquity. I hope that my outline gives some idea of how a second naivete can differ from a more conventional conservative stance within biblical criticism, such as characterizes Bartholomew and some of the other contributors to the manifesto. And that is the end of the second section of this particular article, Theological Interpretation, Second Naivete, and I'll be reading the conclusion next Sunday, or at least that's the plan. So, and I just want to remind everybody, I'm reading this, and I'm sure it seems rather complicated and whatnot, but it's got a beauty to it because it is highly conceptual, highly abstract, and it's also Christian. Very few of the so-called conservatives on the air spend any time at all talking about God or Christianity. Shame on them. So I want to make sure that I do that. Also, it provides a nice contrast. I like to read. I read yesterday from a book called was it The Sun? About it's a book of folk tales from various cultures about the sun, and the actual article or story that I read yesterday was from the Cherokee Nation, and so I think it provides an interesting contrast in terms of communicating conceptually and abstractly, and communicating via storytelling and verbal picture painting. So, until next time, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.